Hi everyone, I'm Sunil Rege, consultant psychiatrist. Welcome to Psych Bytes from the Academy, your source of relevant and important news from around the world in psychiatry and neurosciences. In this edition of Psych Bytes, we'll be looking at 1. The TGA approval of Psilocybin and MDMA in specific circumstances in Australia. Big news that really changes the landscape of the management of depression and post-traumatic stress disorder. 2, we'll be looking at the amazing changes that occur in the brain during pregnancy. 3, we'll be looking at the factors that affect cognitive function in older adults. So first, let's look at the TGA approval for psilocybin and MDMA for very specific indications. Psilocybin for treatment-resistant depression and MDMA for PTSD. This is big news. We know that treatment options for treatment-resistant depression often are quite limited. A number of options are considered, but sometimes patients are stuck. Evidence from recent studies has shown that psilocybin and MDMA may yield therapeutic benefits in such patients, providing they're prescribed in very controlled clinical settings. What the TGA said is from the 1st of July 2023, psychiatrists will be given specialist authorization under the Therapeutic Goods Administration to prescribe psilocybin for treatment-resistant depression and to use MDMA in the treatment of post-traumatic stress disorder. Essentially, what this means is that the TGA has reclassified psilocybin and MDMA as medications. Both these medications will be listed as Schedule 8, which is controlled drugs in the poison standard for these specific uses that I mentioned, and of course Schedule 9 if used outside these settings, because Schedule 9 means that these are prohibited substances. We're not quite sure how this will be implemented in the real world. So we know that authorized prescribers will require an application to the Human Research Ethics Committee. Now, the other challenge is that products containing psilocybin or MDMA, we're not quite sure where these are going to be sourced from, and they haven't been evaluated for their quality, safety, or efficacy in terms of these specific formulations. We know there are so many companies around the world now with this news, of course, making a big dash towards the production of these specific formulations. Now on Twitter, there's of course a huge sort of debate, two sides of the equation. Overall, when we take a step back, great news for psychiatry in terms of advances. We're looking outside the box. Have a look at this Twitter post. Of course, this Twitter post on a lighter note highlights the issues potentially that can occur with the blinding in the trials. But on the other hand, there are experts that are raising some serious concerns about what will happen to patients if this is rolled out without proper scrutiny and regulatory framework around who gets this particular treatment. And we can't forget, last year there was a program that showed some serious concerns.
Uses that happen in psychedelic therapy is being complicit.
How much else has been covered up and how much else is out there?
Four Corners, Monday, ABC TV and ABC iView.
So this is something to wait and watch. Nonetheless, an exciting time to be in psychiatry. Now, whilst this is exciting news, of course, we can't afford to forget that we've got a range of treatments already in existence for treatment-resistant depression, and it's important that we learn how to use it. And this is why on the Academy, we've got the melancholic and psychotic depression course, a 2.5-hour course that takes you through the appropriate psychopharmacological use of these medications in treatment-resistant depression. Moving to our second bite, this takes us to a conference presentation in November 2022, where findings were presented on the neurobiology of the maternal experience. Now, we've summarized an article on the Psych Scene Hub by Hoeksema, who talked about the key areas of the brain involved and that change during the maternal experience. Essentially, the brain changes to prepare for attachment and bonding. And this at times means loss of gray matter in some critical areas, whilst other parts of the brain being activated, preparing for that attachment and bonding experience. Now, in a study by Janice Guilford and colleagues at the Delaware University, the susceptibility or resilience to postpartum depression was studied in a rodent model, and this was found to be linked to changes in neuroimmune markers and hormones that could serve as biomarkers or potential therapeutic targets. Now, this takes us to postnatal psychosis, for example, where hormones or neuroimmunological changes neuroimmunoendocrinological changes play a really, really important part. And therefore, in postpartum psychosis, it becomes crucial to rule out autoimmune conditions as well. And this is something that we've covered in detail, a detailed review of postpartum psychosis, which we've got to recognize is different from postpartum depression. Coming back to another study, Mays and colleagues' latest study suggests that factors regulating gene expression in learning and memory networks may mediate the long-term effects of maternal experience in brain. And this is, of course, in a rodent study. A third study by Dr. Jamie McGuire and colleagues at the Tufts University found that long-lasting antidepressant effects of allopregnanolone in postpartum depression may be due to its effects on coordinating activity across brain regions related to mood. And importantly here, this takes us into the field of neurosteroids, and neurosteroids tend to be GABA-A allosteric modulators. Of course, look out for more information on this on the Academy by Psych scene as well. Now, Hoeksema has already carried out imaging studies that looked at what parts of the brain change during pregnancy. And what's important here is that the network connectivity of the default mode network. Now, the default mode network consists of two key areas. This particular part of the brain, the network, has been covered in melancholic and psychotic depression. You'll see why that's so important. Now, this part of the brain is important because this part of the brain's activated when our mind's wandering, when we're not actively paying attention. Now, when this connectivity is affected, it results in excessive self-referential thinking. And this is where individuals with the severe forms of depression where default mode networks affected, and in pregnancy, this connectivity or coherence is inversely associated with postpartum depression. So essentially the ruminations that we talk about in postpartum depression, often the self-referential thinking, this part of the brain is necessary to separate the baby from the mother. When that's affected, essentially significant features such as guilty ruminations or abnormal thoughts about the baby can start creeping up. So the default mode network seems to play a very, very important role. And then finally, a third bite takes us to a 2023 cognitive function study published in the journal PLOS ONE by Dr. Hui Zheng, professor of sociology at the Ohio State University. What this study looked at was that participants born between 1931 and 1941 had their cognitive functioning measured at age 54 and then again at age 85 as part of a longitudinal, nationally representative health and retirement study with over 7,000 participants. What the study found is that education was found to be the most important predictor of cognitive functioning at age 54. This accounted for approximately 25% of the variance. What this tells us is 75% of the variance comes from other factors, and these factors were race, household income, parental education, occupation, and depression. Contribution of other factors such as chronic disease, health behaviors, gender, marital status, and religion were relatively small at less than 5%. What the researchers found was that the variation in cognitive functioning at age 54 was 3 times as much as the variation in the rate of cognitive decline over the next 30 years. What this tells us is that it's much more important to improve cognitive functioning at baseline rather than to slow the rate of cognitive decline. An interesting finding, though, was that the number of years of college education was not in any way correlated to this cognitive decline, although having a college degree had a small protective effect. What this supports is the cognitive reserve hypothesis, which tells us that some people's brains can adapt and use alternate methods of problem solving when faced with this cognitive decline. Confounding factor, of course, we've always got to think about genetic aspects, for example, ApoE4. And in this study, researchers were not able to adjust for this particular factor, ApoE4, which we know increases the risk of Alzheimer's dementia. But despite this, the study underscores the importance of monitoring cognitive decline in older adults over time. So with that, we conclude this edition of Psych Bytes by the Academy. I look forward to seeing you in another edition soon. If you found this valuable, don't forget to like and comment below. Of course, don't forget to subscribe to our channel as well. If you're a psychiatrist, general practitioner, or a mental health professional, don't forget to check out the Academy, academy.psychscene.com, where you can take your psychiatry training and mental health education to another level. Until next time, stay curious. Bye-bye.